you have learned, that you have learned, but you know, the lessons are still important in 2021 and beyond. So hopefully you'll still be able to take home some takeaway messages, even if it's not something that we've something that's brand new. So I'm going to attempt to put here is my source sheet. I'm also going to try to share my screen in and out. But there's and I'll do this a couple of times if there are people who are joining. I'll just periodically try to place the source sheet down in the chat, and you can feel free to follow along. So I'm going to start. Am I the host? Sorry, I should have checked in with that before, or co-host, or.
I think I made you a co-host.
Okay, perfect. So let me try to share that 1 second. All right. All right, is that good? Are people following along? Okay, great. So I'd like to, we'll start off with source number 1, but specifically, so again, I want to discuss tonight the idea of sinat chinam, the idea of baseless hatred, and how do we know this concept? I mean, a few people are familiar with that phrase, sinat chinam, baseless hatred, groundless hatred. I've seen gratuitous hatred. I think different people, depending on where you look, are translating it in different ways. But we know that the Beit HaMikdash, that the temple, both of our temples were destroyed. And we know that they were destroyed for different reasons. So when we look at source number 1, we look at the Gemara in Yoma, and this is 9b. And I'll do it, I'll start off in the Hebrew, and I'll translate as we go along. Aval mikdash sheni hayu oskin b'Torah uv'mitzvot ugmilut chasadim mipnei macharav. So we know the first Beit HaMikdash, which is a little bit lesser known, the first Beit HaMikdash was destroyed for the 3 cardinal sins, right? We had the Avodah Zarah, we had people that were worshiping idols, we had the Gilui Arayot, we had adulterous behavior, so idolatry, adultery, and we had Shvichut Damim, and we had murder. So the first Beit HaMikdash, it's pretty much a no-brainer when you're engaging in illicit relations, or you're worshiping idols, or you're taking another life. God is not going to, dwell in his home in Jerusalem. So that's why the first Beit HaMikdash was destroyed. Why was the second Beit HaMikdash was destroyed? Because the Gemara is pointing out in the first sentence, Shehayu oskin b'Torah. In the second temple period, the Jews were actually pretty scrupulous with learning Torah. They did a good job with their Torah learning. So they weren't doing shvichut damim, because we know if we follow the 10 commandments, we're pretty much, we're well aware that taking another life is not just frowned upon, but is really wrong. But the people in the second temple era were learning Torah, ube mitzvot, and they were dealing with mitzvot. They had a grasp on the mitzvot, ugmilut chasadim, and they were careful to do chesed and to perform acts of loving kindness. If this is the case, mipnei macharav. So why was the second temple destroyed? If we're saying that what happened in the first temple era didn't happen in the second temple period, mipnei shaita bo sinat chinam. Because in the second temple era, there was this phenomenon known as sinat chinam. L'lametcha sheshkula sinat chinam k'neged shalosh averot avodah zara gilui arayot v'shvichut damim. This comes to teach you that the sin of wanton, so here, sorry, I should have said the translations primarily that I took from my source sheet is from Sefaria. But again, that's why depending on where you look, you'll see different translations. It could be from Chabad.org or different things. So this is from Sefaria. This comes to teach you that the sin of wanton hatred, of sinat chinam, or what I translated as baseless hatred, is equivalent to the 3 transgressions. The 3 transgressions, like I mentioned, that were responsible for taking down building number 1, which is idol worship, forbidden sexual relations, and bloodshed. So that's the reason for the destruction of both temples. In temple number 1, we have, really, really bad behavior. In temple number 2, they're doing better behavior, but there's one thing that they're not doing so well, which is this idea of sinat chinam. So what is sinat chinam? What is this baseless hatred that was so bad that it was enough to take down building number 2, that it was enough that the second Beit HaMikdash, that God said, I can't leave this anymore. What you're doing is so bad, I can't dwell in this place, and I have to get rid of it. So let's go look at source number 2, which again, should be a familiar source. And this is from the Gemara in Gittin. So I'm going to do it in English, primarily because my Aramaic isn't so good. So I'm going to do it in English. And once again, I'm going to, this is the translation that's taken from Sefaria. So the Gemara in Gittin says, Jerusalem was destroyed on account of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa. So there were two men, Kamsa and Bar Kamsa. I guess the equivalent somewhat would be like one man named Goldberg and one man named Goldstein. It's confusing because, you know, the beginning is the same. So we have one man named Kamsa and one man named Bar Kamsa. This is as there was a certain man whose friend was named Kamsa and whose enemy was named Bar Kamsa. He once made a large feast and said to his servant, "Go and bring me my friend Kamsa." The servant went and mistakenly brought him his enemy Bar Kamsa. Okay, so two men, Kamsa and Bar Kamsa. The host of this party happens to be very good friends with Kamsa, and one of his adversaries is Bar Kamsa. And so he tasks one of his servants, which I guess one of our morals of the story could be, if you want to do something, you know, do it, and if you want something to be done right, do it yourself. But he tasks his servant with going and bringing his friend Kamsa, but by accident, he brings the enemy Bar Kamsa. Oh, sorry. All right. The man who was hosting the feast, so I'm over here. The man who was hosting the feast came and found Bar Kamsa sitting at the feast. The host said to Bar Kamsa, "That man is the enemy of that man. That is, you are my enemy. What then do you want here? Arise and leave." So clearly the host is not thrilled with seeing Bar Kamsa there, even though the party, you know, is probably going on, the guests are there, and this is causing a scene, but doesn't matter. He doesn't want him there. He wants him to leave. So Bar Kamsa says to him, "Since I've already come, let me stay and I'll give you money for whatever I eat and drink. Just do not embarrass me by sending me out." Like this is so embarrassing. It's not like, you know, again, like this happened before the party started, nobody's watching. This is probably like, you know, in the middle, or at least the party enough that people are gathered, and they didn't take Jewish time. I guess they actually, you know, shut up somewhat on time. And so the people are there and he doesn't want to be thrown out. And it's just, it's incredibly embarrassing. So he said, "You know what, I'll pay for my meal. Just please let me stay." The host said to him, "No, you must leave." So Bar Kamsa says, so again, classic, you know, Jewish fellows, they're going to have a back and forth. Let's negotiate here a little bit. So Bar Kamsa said, "I will give you money for half the feast. Just do not send me away." So first he offered to pay for his meal only, and that wasn't enough to convince the host. So now he's saying, "I'm going to pay, please let me pay. I'll do half, up to half." I guess he's quoting even from Achashverosh, from the Esther story, you know, "Up to half of my kingdom, I'm willing to give you." So he's willing to pay for half of his meal. The host said to him, "No, you must leave." Again, that's not good enough. So Bar Kamsa comes back. And Bar Kamsa then said to him, "I'll give you money for the entire feast. Just let me stay." So again, I'll pay for everything. And again, we have no sense of how many people were there. So I don't know if he's offering to pay for 20 meals or if he's offering to pay for 200 meals. But again, if anybody here who has made a simcha, making a simcha and you know, buying dinner for, I don't know, 200 guests at a wedding is a hefty sum. So I imagine that, you know, Bar Kamsa offering to pay that, you know, he has money or he's going to work for that money, but that's how desperately he doesn't want to be embarrassed. The host said to him, "No, you must leave." Finally, the host took Bar Kamsa by his hand, stood him up, and threw him out, or took him out. After having been cast out from the feast, Bar Kamsa said to himself, "Since the sages, the rabbis, were sitting there and did not protest the actions of the host, although they saw how he humiliated me, I learned from it that they were content with what he did." So Bar Kamsa says to himself, this was really embarrassing, and clearly his anger is probably going to be directed at the host, but he's not only angry at the host because he's saying that this happened in front of a lot of different eyes, right? We said that there were other people at the party that night. Among the people at the party that night were rabbis, were sages. So again, you can argue that like it's bad enough that, you know, a commoner was watching this scene, but the rabbis, the sages, the leaders, the people that we hold up to a higher standard, these people were watching and didn't do anything and didn't protest the actions of the host. So he learns from this, you know, like shtika kehoda'ah, when you're quiet, it's as if you're saying that that's okay. "I will therefore go and inform against them to the king." So he's going to go to the Roman, right? This is in the time of the Second Temple period. So this is the Romans that were controlling. "I'm going to go and I'm going to go to the king and I'm going to tell on the Jews," right? He's so angry at whoever, which we'll go into in a minute, but he's so angry that he doesn't just leave the party with his anger. He's going to do something about it. He's going to tattletale. He's going to tell on all the Jews to the leading Roman king. He went and said to the emperor, "The Jews have rebelled against you." So the emperor said to him, Who says that this is the case? You know, I have nothing, nobody has told me that the Jews are rebelling. As far as I know, it's status quo. So Bar Kamsa said to him, so let's do a test. Go and test them. Send them an offering. Send a korban, right? The Beit HaMikdash is still standing. It's not going to be for much longer, but the Beit HaMikdash is still standing. The temple is still standing. And what do we do in the temple, among other things? We give korbanot. We sacrifice sacrifices. So go and give a sacrifice. Test them. See if they're going to bring it. Send an offering to be brought in honor of the government, and see whether the Jews are going to sacrifice this Roman-inspired, Roman-sent korban. So the emperor went and sent with him a choice 3-year-old calf. While Bar Kamsa was coming with the calf to the temple, he made a blemish on the calf's upper lip, and some say he made a blemish on its eyelids, a place where, according to us, halacha, it's a blemish, but according to the Gentiles, it's not a blemish. So again, the Romans can say, you know, obviously the Jews are going to sacrifice it. It might have a blemish on it, but for us, we know that certain blemishes on animals render the animal tameh. It renders it impure. And so we can't give something that's impure as a sacrifice. So that's what Bar Kamsa does to this animal. Therefore, when Bar Kamsa brought the animal to the temple, the priests would not sacrifice it on the altar since it was blemished. But they could also not explain this satisfactorily to the Gentile authorities, who did not consider it to be blemished. The blemish notwithstanding, the sages thought to sacrifice the animal as an offering due to the imperative to maintain peace with the government. So basically what the rabbi said is, on the one hand, we cannot give this because we know that giving it a sacrifice that has a blemish, we don't want to set this precedent. It's not allowed. This korban is tameh. It's impure. On the flip side, how are we going to explain this to the Romans? If the Romans say, hey, we know that you didn't give our sacrifice. What, is our sacrifice not good enough for you? So they figured, you know what, maybe in this case only we can bend halacha, we could bend things a little bit for the peace of, I was going to say shalom bayit, but it's not really shalom bayit, but peace with the government. So I guess, you know, ki'ilu, shalom bayit. So maybe we should offer the sacrifice. Rabbi Zachariah ben of Kulas then, so one of the rabbis who's named, everybody else is kind of an unnamed rabbi. Rabbi Zachariah ben of Kulas said to them, if the priests do that, if they do give this korban, even though they shouldn't because of the blemish, the people, Bnei Israel, the people living in Israel will say that blemished animals may be sacrificed as offerings on the altar. So he's worried about the precedent. It's not good because people are going to see that you sacrifice this animal despite its blemish, and they're going to, you know, do that moving forward. So he doesn't think this is a good idea. So again, the sages are stuck because if they don't do this, then, you know, things aren't going to be, the relationship between them and the Romans aren't going to be good. So the sages come up with another plan. If we do not sacrifice it, then we must prevent Bar Kamsa from reporting this to the emperor on the top of page 3. So Bar Kamsa is going to go back and he's going to tell on us and he's going to say that we didn't give the korban. So how do we prevent that from happening? The sages thought to kill him so that he would not go and speak against them. I guess here shades of temple number 1, where we know that murder was one of the reasons that brought down temple number 1. The sages thought, you know what, we'll just kill Bar Kamsa and then he can't go and tattletale on us because he won't be around and alive to do that. Again, Rabbi Zachariah ben of Kulas objects to that as well. If you kill him, people will say that one who makes a blemish on sacrificial animals is to be killed. Again, people will say, why did Bar Kamsa die? Because he brought an animal that had a blemish. So, if I bring a korban and, you know, for some reason I didn't realize, I didn't check it well enough, it has a blemish, I'm liable to the death penalty. So again, Rabbi Zachariah ben of Kulas doesn't like the precedent that this is setting. As a result, they did nothing. So they didn't sacrifice the animal and they didn't kill Bar Kamsa. Bar Kamsa's slander was accepted by the authorities, and consequently the war between the Jews and the Romans began. Rabbi Yochanan closes up this little sugya in the Gemara, and he says, the excessive humility of Rabbi Zachariah ben of Kulas destroyed our temple, burned our sanctuary, and exiled us from our land. So I'll stop sharing for a moment. So again, in summary, again, I think this is a story that people are familiar with more or less, but in closing, we have a party and the host at the party wanted his good friend Kamsa to be there. But instead, his servant got the invitations confused, and he sent the invitation to Bar Kamsa, who's a mortal enemy of the king. Bar Kamsa shows up at the party. The king is furious, and he demands that he leaves. Bar Kamsa is super embarrassed and tries any which way to get him to agree to let him stay. I'll pay for my own meal. I'll pay for half of everybody's meal. I'll pay for the entirety. I'll pay for everybody's meal. Please just let me stay. And none of that works. And he takes him, he picks him up, he throws him out. I have this image of like Uncle Phil in the Fresh Prince when he takes like this adversary of the family, Jazz, and he throws him out like pretty much every episode. He takes him with force, he throws him out, and Bar Kamsa is obviously and I guess rightfully embarrassed, upset, all of the emotions that I think any of us, if we're in his shoes, would be feeling. And specifically, it tells us who he's the most mad at. And it says the rabbis, because the rabbis were at the party that night, didn't do anything, didn't protest, didn't speak up, didn't make a scene. Like they didn't do anything. It sounds like they were just completely silent. And so I think that puts him over the edge. That is even the straw that breaks the camel's back, if you will. And that's what causes Bar Kamsa to take the story to the next level, which is that he goes to the emperor, he goes to the king of the Romans, he tells on the Jews, and then we have this whole story with the Korban and trying to prove that the Jews are rebelling against the Romans, and the Jews don't give the Korban. And this is the beginning of the end, because this shows the Romans that the Jews can't be trusted. The Jews are rebelling. The Jews, you know, we thought that we had a good sense that we're ruling, but the Jews can kind of keep their autonomy if things were going well, but now it's not going well because they're rebelling. And this is the beginning of the end. So this is the story that the Gemara in Gittin brings us to explain what Sinat Chinam is. This is the prototypical example of somebody was wondering, what does baseless hatred, what does gratuitous hatred mean? This is the example. This is the one that gets told over and over, especially at this time of year in the 9 days and Tisha B'Av. So now let's go a little bit further into the story, because there's a lot to unravel here. So I'm going to go back to sharing the screen. So we'll look at, and sorry, I'll just post one more time in the chat in case people came late and they want to follow along. So here's the source. So we're on page 3. Right. Page 3, source 3. So this is from the Ben Ish Chai, Rabbi Yosef Chaim of Baghdad, who lived, I don't know, 100 and change years ago. So this is what the Ben Ish Chai says. The Gemara purposely identifies, this Gemara, the Gemara from Gittin, purposely identifies what initially appears to be an episode of minor importance as the cause for the destruction, because unlike the sins that led to the destruction of the first temple, right, the sins that we said about, adultery and killing and murder and all of that, baseless hatred often involves a low-key offense that the average person would not deem a major transgression. So this Gemara attempts to educate us to take the minor squabbles seriously, right? So what the Ben Ish Chai is saying is that, I guess side to side or side by side, you'd say, well, I totally and completely understand why the first Beit HaMikdash had to come down. A society that is killing is not a society that, merits, the holiest of holies, the Beit HaMikdash with the Chodesh HaKodashim inside. So I understand why the first Beit HaMikdash came down. But the second Beit HaMikdash, like, is this so bad? So people aren't getting along so well, or there's some squabbles or things, a guy came to a party and he threw him out, and that's very embarrassing. But like in the grand scheme of things, nobody was killed, and there was no stealing, and there was no rape, and there's no, I don't know, any of these cardinal, upper echelon sins, you would say. But what the Ben Ish Chai is saying is that, yeah, but when you have these squabbles, and even though at the surface of it, it seems like it's minor, but over time, these minor squabbles can build up and snowball, and they can build into something even greater. And that's what led to the destruction of the second Beit HaMikdash. It's not that there was just this one party and this one-time offense that this happened, and therefore the Beit HaMikdash came down. But clearly, this is indicative of the larger society, of what's going on in Second Temple, in the Second Temple period, is what the Ben Ish Chai says. So now what I want to look at a little bit is who is to blame. So again, we're still in the part of my title, ramifications and remedies. I mean, the ramifications of Sinat Chinam we know is, temples will be destroyed and God will, take away his Shekhinah, his presence from among us. But in order to even fully, or even, more in depth understand the story, so we can maybe learn from it and take away lessons, so that we don't have an instance where you repeat these same mistakes. Who's to blame in the story? So we had a lot of moving parts, a lot of different characters. Who's to blame in the story? So I'd like to draw our attention to source number 4. This is Rav David Millstone. I saw before I was sharing my screen, so I couldn't, sorry. I wanted to stop the share. I don't know. Zahava was here before. I don't know if she's still on, but Zahava is a fellow. She is here. Is a fellow Midreshet Harova alum, and one of my colleagues was here before, Rena Deutsch, who's also a fellow Midreshet Harova alum. So this is Rav David Millstone, who is the I don't know his exact title, but head of school or Rosh Yeshiva of Midreshet Harova, which is a girls' seminary in the Old City. He's still the Rosh Yeshiva. He was there when we were all there, which I won't date myself completely, or Rebitz and Rena, but a good 20 plus years ago. So this is what Rav David Millstone says. So I'll go back to sharing the screen. Source number 4 of David Millstone, the host. The first peculiarity, Rav Millstone says, of the story is that the host is anonymous, right? If we look back in the Aramaic, which I didn't read, the host, it says, Hahu Gavra. There was a man, Gavra from the word Gever, I would say there was a man, unnamed. There was an anonymous man. So the first peculiarity that Rav Millstone points out is that, why aren't we naming him? Shmuel made the party. Reuven made the party. But it doesn't say that. It's Hahu Gavra. Some man, some random guy made the party. Why is it anonymous? Isn't it strange that he remains unnamed, even though it is he who triggered the whole crisis, right? So it's this guy who really, if we want to place blame, would be probably the most or somewhat at the top of your list as to blaming for this whole everything that comes after it. And yet we don't know who he is. It's a random guy. Perhaps the Talmud avoids naming the host so that future generations do not mistakenly identify the incident as being a one-off occurrence. By leaving the host unnamed, the Talmud is teaching us that he could have easily been anyone living at that time, indicating the frequency of this kind of behavior. So again, what Rav Millstone is saying is that if we had named him, you would think that, oh, it's Shmuel. Shmuel made the party. Shmuel is the one who embarrassed Bar Kamsa so horribly. And so the Beit HaMikdash came down because of Shmuel. One guy has this much power that the Beit HaMikdash is going to fall down because of him. And yet what Rav Millstone is saying is that, no, he's not named because it was everybody. Everybody is like this host. Everybody, or at least enough people, the majority of people were behaving in that time like the host. So it could have been anybody. That night it happened to be the host who acted this way, but it could have been anybody. And to bring this point a little bit even further which is why I did 4b, because it's still talking about the host. This is what Rabbi J. Kelman says. Rabbi Kelman, I think many of us know because he's born and raised in Toronto, and he's I think the founder of Torah in Motion. So this is where Rabbi Kelman writes also about the host and placing blame with the host. It is possible, though I think unlikely, so first he's just talking about this story in the Gemara. It's possible, though I think unlikely, that the rabbis are depicting an actual historical event. So he's not sure that this is something that actually happened. Rather, they're reporting on current events. This story or something similar to the story was happening then, and it made its way into the Gemara because it's something that we are reliving and something that we have been doing over and over. While the names, dates, and places may change, this story repeats itself in every generation. This is why the story begins with Hahu Gavra. There was a guy, there was a person, because we are all at risk of being that person. So I'll stop the share again. So again, what we've seen from Rav Millstone and from Rabbi Kelman is that the person that we should be blaming is the host, and yet the host isn't named. And the reason that he's not named is because this was a one small story that was really indicative of the greater picture of what was happening there. So this one host was really, everybody was doing it. And it could be you or me, you or I could be the host one day. We could, find ourselves in a situation where somebody that we don't like shows up and we don't want them there. And, what are we going to do if we're in the host's shoes? And so that's why he's not named, because it was anybody, and it could be you or me, and hopefully it won't be you or me if we're ever faced in a situation such as this. Let's move on. So let's continue and let's look at who else who's potentially to blame. So we've got source number 5. So Rabbi Kelman continues, and he places blame for Kamsa, which is interesting because, again, if you remember the story, Kamsa is actually nowhere in the story. He doesn't go to the party because he never gets the invitation. So here's what Rabbi Kalman says. Not only is he blamed, he is the first one that we blame, right? Because the Gemara started off because of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa, Jerusalem was destroyed. So it's not just because of Bar Kamsa that Jerusalem was destroyed, it was destroyed because of Kamsa as well. And yet, what Rabbi Kalman argues, Kamsa had nothing to do with the events that led directly to the destruction. He wasn't there. Who knows? Did he know that there was even the party? That night he wasn't there. He died. There was no Facebook, there's no social media, so it's not like people are posting selfies like, oh, hashtag party of the century, hashtag good food. You know, he's not there, and yet we're blaming him. So what does Rabbi Kalman argue? And by the way, there was another source that I read, and I don't remember, that also blamed Kamsa, so it's not just Rabbi Kalman if people agree or disagree with this. But he had years to intervene. Sorry, I'm on the third line. He had years to intervene prior to the events. Right? He is friends with this host. Seemingly they're good friends. If you're good friends with someone, don't you know that your good friend has an enemy, Bar Kamsa? Maybe you would try to mend those fences a little bit. Why did he do nothing to help heal the rift between his good friend, Hahu Gavra, this unnamed host, and Bar Kamsa? If he's such a good friend and he knows that he hears this host, who's such his good friend, talking sometimes slander, lashon hara, bad things to say about Bar Kamsa, why wouldn't Kamsa at some point say, hey, you know, dude, I mean, because we don't know his name, hey, fellow, you know, it's not so nice. I hear you railing day after day about Bar Kamsa. You know, like, is there a real reason that, you know, maybe in your head you're mad at him, but, you know, when you actually tell me the details, we'll come to the understanding that it's not, you know, you made a mountain out of a molehill. So he did nothing. It is preventative measures well in advance that must be taken if tragedy is to be avoided. And Rabbi Kalman brings in this saying also from the Gemara, who is wise? One who sees what the future, like Ezehu Chacham, who is wise? One who sees what the future will bring. The time to act is before there is a pressing need to do so. By the time the invitations were sent out for the party, it was too late. Had Kamsa acted, the mistake of the messenger would have been irrelevant. In fact, had Kamsa acted, Bar Kamsa may have been invited to the party, because by that point, maybe Bar Kamsa and the host would have mended the fences. Maybe they would have been friends. So what Rabbi Kalman argues is that, yes, on the one hand, you would say Kamsa has nothing to do with the story, so he shouldn't, no blame should be placed at his feet. And yet the Gemara starts off by saying because of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa, the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed. So Kamsa clearly had something not going for him. And so what Rabbi Kalman argues is that he could have and should have stepped in when he knows that there's this rift, right? If you have two friends and you're like the one in between and you know that the friends are arguing, are you going to sit there and let them, you know, talk smack at each other or behind each other's back to you? Or are you going to at one point be like, guys, we're adults, right? We have no indication that this is a party of teenagers. We have no indication that this is a party of tweens. This is a party of adults. This is a party of grown men, of grown-ups. And this is how they're behaving. So what Rabbi Kalman argues is that Kamsa should have, you know, intervened a little bit sooner. And you know, maybe had he done that, this whole thing wouldn't have happened, because Bar Kamsa probably would have been at the party that night, because he would have at least been on speaking terms with the host. Okay, so again, we have so far the host potentially that's to blame. We have Kamsa who's to blame. Back to Rav Millstone, the rabbi, the Rosh Hashiva of Harova. We have the rabbis. Okay, so this is what Rav Millstone says. It's evident that the final straw for Bar Kamsa was the passivity of the leaders who were at the party but remained silent. The rabbis at the party, and Rav Millstone says in brackets, who interestingly also remain identified, right? We have the only rabbi mentioned in the story is the rabbi at the very end, Rav Zachariah ben Avkulis. Other than that, we have no sense of who was there. Rabban this, Rabbi that, Gamliel, Shlomo, Shmuel, you know, Yochanan ben Zakkai. We have no idea who was at the party. They're all not named. But the rabbis at the party may have been unable to stop the argument between the host and Bar Kamsa, but they surely had the option to leave the party and protest, right? You could see something going on and you can say, well, I can't break that up. I'm just one person. I can't get involved. Okay, maybe you can't break it up, but you can do something. You can say, hey, you know, make a scene. And then somebody else, by the time you make a scene, people can come and help you, you know, do what you need to do. And he brings in this famous quote, the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. So again, we have these three potential options as to who's to blame in this story that leads to the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, or is one of the reasons that the second Beit HaMikdash was destroyed. We have the host, who, I think anybody would blame because of the way that he embarrassed so publicly. And we know that there's that a Gemara also that talks about, embarrassing someone is equivalent to killing someone. So there really is something so dangerous and harmful in public shaming and public embarrassment. So we have the host who's to blame, and we talked about how the host could be any one of us because that's why he's not named. We can all potentially act like that. Then we have Kamsa, who you could say, wow, we're really knocking down a guy who was not even in the story. That's a little bit rough. It's a little bit harsh. But again, you could argue that he knew that there was this strife, this animosity between the host and between Bar Kamsa, and he didn't do anything. And so had he potentially said something along the way, maybe, again, we don't know, hindsight's 2020, but maybe the story doesn't unravel and unfold the way that it does. And then the last answer that we saw is from Rav Millstone, who blames the rabbis, who blames the sages. Again, it's not just random, John Doe, Ploni Almoni, an unnamed fellow who was at the party and didn't do anything. It was the leaders that were at the party and didn't do anything. And again, for those of you, or for those of us who want to argue and say, well, what were they supposed to do? Sometimes, you see two men going at it. I don't know that I want to get in. I don't know that I want to get in the way of that. But even if you're not going to get up and play bodyguard or play, you have to punch like a referee gets in the between, two guys who are fighting in hockey, the referee has to kind of stand in harm's way. Even if you don't want to put yourself in harm's way, you still could have made a scene. They could have walked out in protest. Rav Millstone goes on to argue, I didn't include this in the quote, but he goes on to argue maybe they could have placed the host in cherem, in some type of excommunication, which is such a harsh thing to do, that you could show that what he did was so wrong. Right. I sent this email and I apologize. I'm going to forget the girl's name now. So somebody can throw it in the chat if they remember. But one of the stories that I tried to teach to my students when it happened was the story in the case with George Floyd. It wasn't just that it was caught, like we know the story and we know what happened because there was I forget her age, so I'm gonna get it wrong again, but I think it was a teenage girl who was on the scene in Minnesota and in Minneapolis that day, had her phone, took out her phone and started recording. So she might've felt like, I can't, thank you, Darnella Fraser. She might've felt like, I can't stand up to the police officers. They're clearly doing something wrong here. They're kneeling on this guy. The guy is asking for he can't breathe. And so she might say, well, I can't do anything because who am I? I'm not gonna stand up to a bunch of, big men, police officers. And I think there was 4 of them. So even the odds aren't great. It's not just 1-on-1, it's 1 against 4, but she still had the ability to whip out her phone and to take a video and make sure that it gets spread out far and wide. So too, what Rav Millstone is arguing is that the rabbis there that night, even if they didn't want to get in between and maybe it was going to come to blows and it was going to come to a fist fight or whatever, even if they didn't want to get involved that strongly, they should have done something to indicate that they don't side with this public shaming, that this public shaming of the host is so wrong, and yet they did nothing. So we have all these people to blame. Again, Bar Kamsa, who I didn't add to the sheet just because I think that's the most obvious, even the host is obvious as well, but I also argue that Bar Kamsa is obvious in the sense that he takes his anger, which you can argue he was right to be angry, he was right to be hurt. Those are all validated. We can validate his feelings of being shamed and hurt and all of that, but then taking that and using it to go and tattletale and to tell on the Jews, and that leads to the destruction. So we know of Bar Kamsa. So now I want to flip a little bit or continue on. We know who's to blame. We know, kind of if we were ever to find ourselves in this scenario, if you're the host, don't publicly shame. If you're the person sitting there, don't play the rabbi card and do nothing. You should speak up. If you're Kamsa and you hear your friends are kind of like talking about each other behind their back, but to you, you can at one point be like, I don't really like listening to this. Each of you keep, talking to me about the other one. I don't like being in the middle. So like either, I'm going to cool off our friendship until you two can come, or maybe I can be the peacemaker and I can bring you two together, but I'm not just going to sit here and let you guys talk bad about each other just to me. So you could have played Kamsa, and we can play Kamsa and try to mend fences before, again, things get too bad. But I don't want to just sit here and say, things are bad and Sinat Chinam is terrible and it's the 9 days and we all have the potential to be the host and we all have the potential to be Kamsa. What can we do about this? What remedies, what actions can you or I take to try to make sure that this is the last, and we say this every year, but really we mean it. I hope that this is the last year that Tisha B'Av is a mournful day. And God willing, hopefully after Tisha B'Av, this Tisha B'Av, we can take our keynote and we can put them finally into the Shemus box, into the Geniza box, because we don't need them anymore. So how do we make that happen? I want to not have to buy keynote next year, if I or borrow keynote from the shul, because they give them out and they let us take them for the day or for shacharit. I don't want to use it. I want to put it in Geniza, out of sight, out of mind. It's in its Jewish burial. But how do we get to that point? So a couple of remedies. So I'm going to go back to sharing my screen. So here we have. So Rabbi Doron Perez, who I don't know if he still is the head of World Mizrahi, but at one point he was the head of World Mizrahi. And this is what Rabbi Perez says. The Torah hints, and anybody who was in the tent yesterday at Shir Shemaim, Rabbi Diamond also spoke about this a little bit in his Pri Musaf drasha. So Rabbi Doron Perez says, the Torah hints to the cure of this destructive phenomenon of Sinat Chinam when it tells us that Aharon the priest, that Aharon the Kohen, passed away on Rosh Chodesh Av. So yesterday was Rosh Chodesh Av, and the Torah tells us, so what Rabbi Diamond told us yesterday, is that's the only yurtzeit that the Torah mentions. We know from kind of like around the fact that Moshe Rabbeinu's yurtzeit is the 7th of Adar, but it's not mentioned in the Torah. But the Torah tells us that Aharon, that his yurtzeit, that he passed away on Rosh Chodesh Av. At the onset of the 9 days, the most tragic time in Jewish history, we are charged to recall Aharon's life and legacy. Aharon was the national peacekeeper. And at this time of year, we should evoke Aharon's memory and aim also to strive, it's supposed to say the cure, I apologize, to strive for the cure, not to strive for the cute. So Rabbi Perez is suggesting is that why, what's a remedy? Yesterday we were thinking or talking a little bit about Aharon because it was his yurtzeit yesterday. So his name came up, in our shul or maybe around your Shabbat table. And what do we think of? What should be, forefront of our mind when we're discussing Aharon? What was Aharon the most known for? Ohev Shalom, Verodev Shalom. He was a guy who loved peace and pursued peace. And therefore, one of the ways that we can hopefully, remedy this illness of Sinat Chinam, the cure for Sinat Chinam, is by imitating Aharon and by ourselves becoming people who love peace and pursue peace. Oseh Shalom B'Ramav, right? If we imitate God, and God is the one who makes peace, we too should be the ones who are,
actively pursuing peace.
So that's Rabbi Perez, what he suggests.
What do you want me to do?
Jonathan Sachs of blessed memory comes up with a different.
A barrel Bessin.
Somebody needs to mute.
Oh, sorry. Okay, I thought somebody's asking a question. Well, I'll check that after. Thank you. So Rabbi Sachs of blessed memory. What does Rabbi Sachs say? So I started off with his quote, and then I apologize, I didn't have time to put the rest there, but I will speak it. And if you want, I can give you the larger quote. I can send that out after. Rabbi Sachs says, ours is the only civilization I know whose canonical texts are anthologies of arguments. The prophets argued with God, rabbis argued with one another. We are a people of strong views, and I think we can all say that, with a little bit of a smile, because, we are the Jewish people. We do like a good argument every now and then. However, when it causes us to split apart, it becomes terribly dangerous. So on the one hand, what Rabbi Sachs is saying is that, yes, we do like a good argument now and then. And if you open up Tanakh, right away, again, just reflecting on what I teach, and one of the things that I teach in Opana is Bereshit. And in Bereshit, I have this instance already in my mind. I think it's in chapter 18 in Perek Yud when God wants to destroy Sodom. And he tells Abraham, he gives Abraham a heads up, and Abraham, literally goes toe to toe with God. And you can read this chapter and you could say, wow, that's quite a bit of chutzpah that Abraham is, challenging God. What do you mean you're going to destroy Sodom? How can you take out a whole place, even if there's, some righteous people? You're telling me that the entire place is really Rishaim, is really wicked people. And he goes on this back and forth. What happens if there's 50 tzaddikim? And God's like, okay, fine. If there's 50 tzaddikim, I won't destroy them. And then you go back, okay, what happens if there's 45 tzaddikim? Right? You look in many places in the Tanakh, we have prophets arguing with God, like Rabbi Sachs says. We have people going at each other. And so you can argue that that's kind of the Jewish spirit. You go into any Beit Midrash or a lively Beit Midrash and you'll hear arguments. You'll hear chavrutas, learning partners that are, speaking, but you can walk in as a bystander. You can think that they hate each other because they're shouting, but really they're just shouting because each one is so thinks that their side of the argument is correct. But Rabbi Sachs says the danger is that, yes, we're an argumentative people. And yes, you can read the Tanakh and find, umpteen numbers of stories of arguments. The danger is when I think the arguments go from argument like l'shem shamayim, if you will, an argument that's in the name of Hashem, to an argument that, you're not arguing for the name of Hashem, but you're arguing just for the sake of I'm right, you're wrong, I'm going to prove you wrong, and I'm going to prove myself right, like an egotistical argument. So Rabbi Sachs suggests a few scenarios or a few remedies to how to fix this. So how can we prevent our arguments, which, we should maintain that we're allowed to argue, but not argue that it gets out of hand and gets to the point where it leads to sinat chinam and further destruction. So one of his cures for this illness, if you will, is he invokes the story with Yosef and his brothers. So, people are familiar, it's chapter 36, 37, again, of Bereshit, which we know Jacob had 12 sons, and one of the sons, Yosef was the beloved, child of Yaakov, which led to a lot of jealousy, strife between the brothers, to the point where the pasuk tells us, "V'lo yachlu dabro l'shalom." The brothers couldn't even speak to him in peace. So Rabbi Sachs argues in this sentence, in this pasuk, "Lo yachlu dabro l'shalom," is not just that they couldn't speak to him in peace; they stopped speaking. And how do we remedy ills? How is one way that we can make sure that sinat chinam is not something that, is pervasive in our society like it was back then? We need to keep communication open. You can disagree with someone, you can have an argument with someone, but let's not do that thing where it's like, I argue with you, so I can't talk to you. You're not invited to my table. You're not welcome in my shul. We need to keep the lines of communication open. Lo yachlu dabro l'shalom. They couldn't speak about him in peace. Rabbi Sachs is arguing they couldn't even speak about him. They couldn't speak to him. The lines of communication were broken. And so we need to keep the lines of communication open if we want to remedy that. A second answer, or a second hint that Rabbi Sachs suggests, is if we know there's in the Gemara, we have Beit Hillel and we have Beit Shammai. We have Hillel and we have Shammai. People are familiar with these two names of Hillel and Shammai. And most of us are also familiar that the halacha that tends to follow Hillel. If there's an argument that will say, Hillel said X, Y, Z, right? Even lighting the candles on Hanukkah, right? We're familiar that there's that argument. Some people say to light left to right, and some people say, no, you go from, candle 8 and every night you take one away. So then it's candle 7, then it's candle 6. But we do the opposite. We do candle 1 on the first night, candle 2 on the second night, right? And we increase. So we know that Beit Hillel, we know that Hillel and Shammai disagree, and yet the halacha follows Hillel. Why does the halacha follow Hillel? Why is he the one that's followed? Says Rabbi Sachs, and what can that teach us again about trying to cure the sinat chinam? Says Rabbi Sachs that Hillel was the type of person that every time he would teach, he would start off by teaching Shammai's version first. He strove so much to understand where Shammai was coming from. He didn't just dismiss Shammai's views. He didn't just dismiss Shammai's opinions. I'm gonna give a shir, and I'm gonna start off by quoting Shammai. I'm gonna start off by invoking what Shammai said, because he so much wanted to understand him before he went on and gave his own answers and gave his own views. So argues Rabbi Sachs, or says Rabbi Sachs, is that's again a lesson that we should take and follow Hillel. The reason the halacha follows Hillel is that, again, you can disagree with someone. You can have a different side of the story, whether it's whatever, today, England versus Italy, in the Euro, you can be on two different sides, or if it's something, not as fun as sports, but something with politics, you can agree, disagree, but the point is that you should strive to understand the other side. Don't just dismiss the other side and just say your opinion is wrong, black, white. It's not as simple as black, white. It's not like that. And that's another answer that Rabbi Sachs suggests. I was thinking about sinat chinam. We know in the book of Noah, the second book in the Sefer Bereshit, we have two stories that there's two punishments that you speak about when you learn the book of Noah. The first one is the flood, which I think dominates the majority of the chapters of Sefer Noah, right? God destroyed the world save for Noah and his family with a big flood. And later in the same parsha, in chapter 11, in Perek Yud Aleph, we get the story of Migdal Bavel, the story of the people who were building this tower to challenge God. And the punishment for Migdal Bavel, there's no flood, been there, done that. God has done the flood. The punishment for Migdal Bavel of these people who tried to build this structure to challenge God's authority was that God spread them around, confused their languages, and sent them off to the corners of the world. I think it's the Ramban. It could be Rashi, but I believe it's the Ramban who says there. We have these two stories. You have the story of Noah with the flood. You have the story of Migdal Bavel, and the punishments are vastly different. And yet, you would think that the punishment for Migdal Bavel would be worse because they're challenging God. They're going after God. They're saying, "Who are you to dominate the heavens and the earth?" So the people are clearly, it's a Bein Adam LaMakom issue. It's a between man and makom. The makom is God. That's why I say Hamakom Yinachem et Shiva, because it's another name for God. The people were challenging God, and yet they're not killed. But in the flood story, there's mass killing, there's mass destruction because of the flood. What was the sin that took place in the flood? Hamas. What's Hamas? It's violence. It's violence between men. Says the Ramban, God doesn't care so much. God has thick skin. If you're challenging God in the Migdal Bavel story, he's not going to kill you because that doesn't anger God as much. Why did God send the flood? Why did God say this world cannot exist as in its current state, and he sends the flood? Because of sins that are bein adam lechavero, because of sins that are between man and another man, between a person and his or her friend. That is something that God says, I cannot keep the world going. I have to send a flood. And so too in second temple era, God says, Sinat Chinam, yes, you can argue the story, the Bakamsa story. It's such a small story, okay? That's the reason the Beit HaMikdash came down. God can't stand Bein Adam L'Chaviro. God cannot stand when we have internal strife. Again, we can take the same example for Yom Kippur. You and I are pretty aware with the fact that Yom Kippur will give us atonement for sins, again, that are Bein Adam L'Makom. If you ask God and you hit your chest enough for 25 hours with your Ashamnu Bagadnu Al Chetz, and you do your tashlich and all this stuff leading up to it, your slichot, God will grant you forgiveness. He just like he granted the people of Nineveh. When is God not going to step in, and when is God not going to give you the atonement? When you don't do the work Bein Adam L'Chavero, when you don't do enough to try to mend fences, to try to mimic Aharon, to try to take a little bit of Aharon and be an Ohev Shalom and a Rodev Shalom. I think, again, if we take these examples with us, whether or not we find ourselves in a situation like the host, like the rabbis at the party of Kamsa Bar Kamsa, maybe we won't be in a situation like that. But if we are, I think we all know now the way to react and the way not to react, right? Silence doesn't help anybody, or if anything, it helps the oppressors. But not just that, I think it's, again, the story, even going back to the Ben Ish Chai, it's a small story, but it's all these small stories that add up to something greater. And I think we all, if we, the cure to Sinat Chinam, we know, is Ahavat Chinam, is loving people for no reason, just like hating people for no reason took down the Beit HaMikdash. What's going to bring it back up? Loving people for no reason, which we've seen sadly, but nicely, if you will, in the last 2 months. First with the Meron tragedy. I think we can all say that nobody who died in the Meron tragedy would have been members of Sher Shemaim had they been living in Toronto. It doesn't matter. Nobody looked at what they looked like and what sect or what Judaism they subscribed to. Everybody wanted to help. Everybody wanted to send donations to the family of the 45 people that were killed in Meron. And what we're seeing now, again, play out in front of us on social media, on the TV, in Surfside, you have multiple Jews, again, Jews from Lakewood, Jews from different walks of life who were killed in the Surfside tragedy. And we have Israel that sends a team, almost right away, Hatzalah, Zaka. We have people from, again, different shuls, different communities that are stepping up and stepping in to help, because it doesn't matter what side, of the aisle you are on. It doesn't matter if you're, Reform or Orthodox, or what what type of Judaism you subscribe to. We can all do our parts, and hopefully it doesn't take a tragedy to make us behave and kind of unite this way. But hopefully we'll take the examples that we've been seeing play out in front of us in these last few months since May, and take that with us. And hopefully, like I said, this is the last Tisha B'Av that we need to use our keynote, and next year we can bury it in Geniza because we won't need it anymore. Thank you all. So I see that there was a point here, Zahava. I missed it before. It's interesting that no one blames Bar Kamsa, who's the one taking revenge, betraying the Jewish people as a whole, almost as if the Gemara sees his action as understandable or even justified. Yeah, you're right. Because on the one hand, you think that it's so obvious that he's the one that's to be blamed, but on the other hand, maybe what he did wasn't so right. We could place ourselves in his shoes, I think, a lot in terms of the anger. Although again, I don't know how many of us would then take that anger and use it to you're upset if the shul is doing something, so you're going to call the police and have the shul and get a citation for something. I don't know that we would take it that step. So I think that's where he really went off the rails a little bit. But I do think that his anger is justified in terms of his action being justified. It's interesting that the Gemara, at least on the surface, does take that. I don't know if anybody has any other questions but I'm happy to explore further comments or questions. Thank you, Efrat.
Amazing. Thank you.
That was amazing. Thank you.
Amazing. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you,
very
Miriam.
much.
Thanks, Miriam. Great job.
Thank you.
Yashir Koach, Miriam, exceptional.
Thank you, Rose. I really appreciate it.
I thought it was really wonderful.
Thank you so much.
You are great as always.
Mrs. Riff, #1 Red Sox fan. I'll take it because Sinat Chinam, I'll place the Blue Jays Red Sox.
Okay. As long as we
rivalry
communicate,
aside.
that's the best.
I have to practice what I preach.
You put a lot of research into that. It's very good.
Thank you, Mrs. Goldman.
I'm Sharon.
Ayasher Koach to Brenda Bessin, who gets commission.
All right.
Very nice. Thank you all very much.
Very inspirational, Miriam.
Thank you. Thank you.
Just what we need.
Thank you, Rebbitzin.
It was excellent.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Have a good night, everyone. Good evening.
It's really good.